Hi,
All right.
everybody. Welcome to the February 2024 FANAC Fan History Zoom. I'm Edie Stern. I am the FANAC webmaster, and I would like to introduce to you today Perry Middlemiss and Leigh Edmonds, who are going to talk about Australian fandom between 1960 to 1975, or Wrong Turns on the Wallaby Track Part 2. So, gentlemen, if you will introduce yourself and take it away.
Good morning, because it is morning here in beautiful sunny Australia. Good morning to everybody around the world, and welcome to this part two of this FANAC Zoom session featuring Dr. Leigh Edmonds, who will be here to talk about the history of Australian fandom from, on this occasion, from 1960 to 1975. This is part two of his overall history, which started back in the 20s or early 30s in Australia, and we're moving right up through to 1975, with our endpoint being the running of the first World Science Fiction Convention in Melbourne, in Australia, known as Aussicon. As I said, my name is Perry Middlemiss, and previously on this channel, we actually got ourselves, in the first part of this session, we got ourselves up to the end of the 1950s. We dealt with all the ins and outs and machinations of fandom in Sydney. And now we're starting to see a resurgence or a elevation of fandom in Melbourne in the late 1950s, which is where we finished up in the first session. And we finished with Leigh saying that Mervyn Binns was the one that was going to be doing a lot of work, keeping Melbourne and, in fact, Australian science fiction fandom together. So, Leigh, what was the
Here
overall
I am.
interest?
Yeah.
Here you
Leigh
are. Thank you.
Edmonds, historian, fan, etc., etc. Can we have the first and second slides, please, Maestro? They must be there somewhere. I'm going to take you back to, in fact, the next one, please. Back to 1953, 52, 53. Oh, we've gone in the wrong direction. Next one. Yeah, there we go. This is the Melbourne Science Fiction Group in about 1953. Along the bottom, you've got Bob McCallum, Bert Chandler, Race Matthews. Across the top, we've got Merv Binns and Dick Jensen. Of those, the only two left are Dick and Race, and neither of them are in very good health. They formed the Melbourne Science Fiction Group, which in about 1957-58 was renamed the Melbourne Science Fiction Club. And one by one, they all sort of disappeared apart from Merv. So if we can have the next picture, please. Here's Mervyn Binns outside the Melbourne Science Fiction Club, about 1960. Could be a little bit later. Mervyn is all that's left. When you get the history that I've written of the first part, this picture is on the cover, and it signifies that, yes, exactly, Mervyn Binns is running the Melbourne Science Fiction Club more or less single-handed. He is the only obvious face of fandom in Australia. Next picture, which is the inside of the Melbourne Science Fiction Club. It's up on the second floor of the McGill's News Agency warehouse in Somerset Lane. Merv works at the Somerset, works for McGill's. The area is vacant. He's got the club to move in there. What you're looking at is Paul Stevens of the hydraulic lift. The only way to get up to the club is the hydraulic lift. And if we have the next picture, you will actually see the whole hydraulic lift in use. So that if what Merv was doing was he was selling science fiction. In fact, just about the only place you could buy science fiction in Melbourne was in McGill's. And in McGill's, everything that Merv sold science fiction was putting a little slip advertising the Melbourne Science Fiction Club, which is how I found out about it in 1965. The person we've got here, the main picture here, is Mervyn Barrett, who is a New Zealander who moved to Melbourne in about 1962. And if we have the next picture, please. Merv was a very social person. He held a lot of parties. and he brought together to his parties people in Melbourne who didn't really know each other. For example, John Foyster and Lee Harding reputedly met each other at a pornographic film night that Merv Barrett held at some stage. While obvious fandom in Australia is at the Melbourne Science Fiction Club, there are a couple of fans who have discovered fandom overseas. And if you have the next picky, please. Two of those, on the left, we've got Lee Harding. In the centre, we've got Ron Smith, who moved to Australia after the Cuban Missile Crisis. And we've got John Baxter. Now, both Harding and Baxter are aspiring writers. They both want to be writers, but they've discovered fandom through the pulp magazine, through the letter columns. They got to meet each other. They were both starting to sell to New Worlds. And so they got to know each other. So there's a little group that's forming around being writers. If we can have the next one, please. But there's also a fan group. So what we've got here is Dick Jensen. Remember back to the early picture. This is Dick in about 1962. Then we've got John Foyster. John Foyster had known about science fiction fandom since 1956, but he didn't go to any of the two conventions because he wasn't terribly interested in that stuff. John Foyster is probably one of the smartest people I've ever met. Got a very sharp brain. I would have met through my history jobs a lot of very smart people, and John would be in the top 3 or 4, maybe 5. Next to him is a young Neo fan called John Bangsund, who has just been brought in. He met Lee Harding at a party. Lee Harding has now been introducing him into science fiction. John's not terribly interested in science fiction, but he's interested in Lee Harding and the group of people that Lee Harding is mixing with, i.e. science fiction fans. So if we go on to
Lee, so when was this? When was
we're talking the
John
early
Baxter?
60s.
Still early 60s?
Say 62, 63. Both Lee and John wrote about their meeting at a party that John Bangston went to. They first meet mentally through what would you call it? Through classical music, an interest in classical music. And in fact, all these three here are more, you would actually say, more interested in literature and art, movies and music than they are in science fiction. But because they've got this interest in science fiction, they've got the particular sort of fannish mindset that brings them together. So gradually a group is starting. Yes, keep going.
Oh, well, I was going to ask, so you've been talking a lot about Melbourne science fiction at the moment. What else was going on around the country?
Nothing.
Was it nothing at all? Oh,
Nothing at all.
That keeps us well
Nothing at
focused
all.
then.
Oh, no, sorry. There's John Baxter in Sydney, who actually is in touch with a couple of the old Futurians Thursday Night Group people. But by 1960, that's all blown up. And the smarter ones have gone into what people wouldn't know of as the Sydney Push, which is sort of the most intellectual group in Australia. You will know the names Germaine Greer and Clive
James,
who are members of the Sydney Push.
Robert Hughes.
Yep, there's quite a few members of the Sydney Push, so that the smarter fans in Sydney have been absorbed into the Push. There isn't anything like that in Melbourne, so this little fan group is starting to form. So if we come to the next picture, I think that's actually of some, as this group comes together. So here's a picture taken in the Melbourne Science Fiction Club, say 63, 64. You can tell it's the Melbourne Science Fiction Club because right up the back, in black, in little black cover, is the AFPAR duplicator that is one of the foundation items of Australian science fiction, and probably Mark Orlieber's got it in his under his house. So along the bottom, we've got John Bangsund. We've got someone I don't know. No, sorry, that'll be Carla Harding, Lee Harding's wife, Bob Smith, and then the other two I don't know. Across the top, we've got Foyster, Harding, don't know the next two. Up the back is John Strayed, Merv Binns, and Dave Sofar. partly members of the Melbourne Science Fiction Club, partly members of the newly forming group. The useful thing about the Melbourne Science Fiction Club in Somerset Place was it was a place where you could go. If you knew that the lift was there, you pulled the chain, the lift came down, you went up. It wasn't locked. So you could go there anytime you like. And Foyst used it to run off his sap scenes and his fanzines. I went there one time, this would be 66, and there he was running off his sap scene sometime at lunchtime. No one else there, no one knew, no one cared. So this is the group that's starting to form. So if we go on to the next one.
John Ryan was from Sydney.
Yeah, we'll come to John. So this is even the sort of the centre of that group. Now, I don't know the woman on the end, but John Foyster had a girlfriend before he met Elizabeth. That might be her. Foyster, Bangsund, Merv Barrett, Lee Harding, Carla Harding, and little Eric. And they are the group that's sort of the hardcore of this emerging fandom in Australia. Or
So,
Melbourne.
you were talking about them meeting quite a lot, going to a lot of parties and socialising. Yeah. Were they also producing fanzines and publications?
Yeah, in fact, you picked up. Now, I can't pick up. It must be, was in previous, actually it's in the previous picture. Carla, I think it is holding a copy of, whatever it was called. John, there we go. Yeah, Opus, or whatever it was called. John Bangsund had gone to the Arts Festival in Adelaide and written Harding letters back describing what he saw. Very good letters. And so Harding produced, after 8 years, decided to produce a fanzine. And so he produced their fanzine, which is basically Harding, Bangsund's letters to back to Harding. And also I think it's got the beheading of Basil Pott, which is a very ingenious little science fiction story that Bangsund wrote. Got Bangsund illustrations. It's actually quite a charming little fanzine, but there was only one of them. Anyhow, onwards. Otherwise you'll be here forever. Yeah, I can't see what Merv's holding. I wouldn't be surprised if it's got to do with cinema. One of the things we'll come to is that this group is as interested in is interested in cinema as they are in science fiction, so that the Melbourne Science Fiction Club is also the home of the fantasy film group. And the money that the club survives basically through holding film nights, remembering, of course, that science fiction was not shown very often. And if you turn the camera around, you'll see probably a row of 5 or 6 rows of cinema seats. And then if you look up, you will see a table tennis table, and beyond that, a big white screen that people showed movies on. I don't think.
So you mentioned, Leigh, you mentioned that not much else was happening around the rest of Australia in fandom. What about Graham Stone up in Sydney? Was he on the scene at this stage?
Graham Stone, if you want the full story, chapter 12 of the book I've written, Graham Stone is sticking to the original Futurian idea of what science fiction should be and what fandom should be. He isolated himself through a series of steps entirely from what's happening in Sydney with John Baxter and Bob Smith, and what's happening in Melbourne. He doesn't want to know about them. He thinks they've gone. This is why you use the phrase on the emu track, because
on the Wallaby track.
Graham Stone thinks that fandom's gone in the wrong direction.
Okay.
What happened is he's isolated himself not only from Australian fandom, but from the international fandom. And what's happening with this group I'm talking about is Baxter in 1959 started producing a fanzine, Bunyip I think it was, or Quantum, which in fact isn't circulated in Australia. It gets circulated overseas. In about 1960, 61, Foyster starts producing a fanzine. He joins SAPS. Baxter joins OMPA. And so this fan group is not relating to what's left of the old fandom in Australia. It's relating to overseas fandom, and it's drawing its inspiration from overseas fandom. I like to think that a lot of the spirit of Australian fandom comes from what John Foyster learned from SAPS in that early period, sort of the leftovers of sixth fandom, as it was in America in the early 50s. Baxter and Baxter and Foyster are picking up this trend of fannish fandom and bringing it to Australia, whereas fannish fandom, apart from what Lee Harding tried to do in the 50s, it didn't exist in Australia because Australian fans had this idea that science fiction had to be treated seriously if the general public were going to take it seriously. And so they were very sercon in their approach, whereas this new mob, are drawing their inspiration from what's happening in fandom in America.
So you got the Foyster, Banks and Harding group down in Melbourne.
Yeah.
And you got the Baxter and Smith group up in Sydney. They're basically looking at fandom, looking at science fiction in a similar way. So it's social. It's more, yes, they're reading science fiction, but it's more fannish fandom that you know about.
Yes, it's fannish fandom, but the other thing that's happening is that the criticism, the commentaries that the Futurians in Sydney in the 50s and Stone would continue to do until he died was this very restrained analytic view of science fiction, very much into bibliography, into short, concise reviews, not into the kind of criticism that became the mode. And it turns out that Foyster and Harding in particular, and John Baxter to some extent, are very good, very sharp brains when it comes to reviewing and criticism. Harding had come into fandom in 52, 53, and he discovered a fanzine coming out of Sydney produced by Rex Meyer called Science Fiction Review. And all it was members of the Futurians wrote reviews of things. And Harding was very impressed by this. He produced two fanzines in 56, 57 called Antipodes, in which he tried to involve himself in fannish fandom overseas, but it also contains pretty good criticism and reviewing of what's going on, so that there is, as well as being fannish, look, all the best fandom is a combination of sercon and fannish. The best fan writers, Willis, Tucker, whoever you like, are just have the ability to do both and to do it well. My problem is I'm only good at the fannish side, never any good at the sercon stuff. So what's evolving in Melbourne is this ability to write well about science fiction, but also to enjoy it in a fannish fashion that they're learning from their involvement in American fandom.
Okay, so we've got so you've got a lot of that going on between the fannish and the sercon stuff happening in Melbourne. A name that you haven't mentioned, and I know that he was probably around about this stage, was Don Tuck. Was he down? Was he in Hobart at the time?
He's in Hobart. Don Tuck is a bit like Graham Stone. He's a year old, 1940s, Don Tuck came into fandom in 1940. But what happened? Oh, maybe I should take a step back to explain something that's going on in Melbourne in the 40s and 30s, 40s and 50s. Sorry, from the 1941 when the embargo on science fiction starts, so that science fiction, American science fiction, isn't coming into Australia. What it forces Australian fans to do is to become collectors, because there's not the flow of science before the embargo. I forget the numbers now, but Vol Molesworth was buying, I don't know, half a dozen titles coming off the newsstands every 3 weeks. Every 3 weeks, because the boats come in every 3 weeks from America. When the embargo comes in, the government is not allowed to, you're not allowed to spend money overseas on American stuff. All this dries up. So that fans in Australia, I'm sure that fans around the world are going and looking for other science fiction as well. But in Australia, it becomes serious because that's where you're going to find stuff. Somehow, people are getting, I don't know, the other people are offloading their collections so that Australians become very serious about trawling secondhand bookshops. Anywhere that they think they might find science fiction and building up collections because there's no new science fiction coming in. So they have to get science fiction from somewhere. One of the problems the Futurians had was science fiction people like to talk about science fiction, but if you're not getting science fiction, what do you talk about? You end up talking about yourselves. You start feuding. That's what went on in Sydney, even into the I reckon, even into the 50s. The other thing that has happened in 1959 is the embargo is lifted, so that science fiction now gradually flows in again. But you've got to remember that science fiction is looked upon badly. Remember that you said at the Canberra Convention, if you had told people when you're running the 99 Worldcon that it was a science fiction convention, you would have had problems. So that in 1960, if you say you read science fiction, well, people think you're strange. You don't bring science fiction up in general communities. One of the reasons why the Melbourne Science Fiction Club is a haven for many people, me included, is because when you get in that hydraulic lift and you go up to the science fiction, you can actually talk about science fiction and people won't think you're strange. So these are all the cultural things that are going on at the same time. Where was I?
About there. Yeah,
Oh,
coming
right,
back
about
through
there.
to, I derailed you and took you off to Sydney and then down
That's
to
right.
Hobart. So let's go
Yeah.
back to Somerset Place again.
Yeah. So
And
when
we've
we
got
go
all
back,
these
go back
meetings. Are they having regular weekly or
oh, yeah,
monthly meetings?
you turn up, no, monthly, weekly meetings. I think
Okay.
it was Wednesday night. Turn up on Wednesday night. I remember the first time I went. There's a bunch of, it's in Somerset Lane, a little lane in Melbourne, and there's some cars and there's people standing around. I don't know these people. They're all waiting for something. And then this man arrives with a key and he sticks it in the door and opens the door, and we all go in and get into this lift and go up somewhere. But when you go in there, there's science fiction everywhere. There's people who talk science fiction who understand that you talk science fiction as well. It doesn't matter if you actually end up talking about something entirely different. It's not strange that you talk about science fiction. So can we have the next slide, please? So,
Seem to be having a slide problem, but that's all right.
here we go. No, it's all pushing
Okay, so
buttons. So here at Melbourne
that's
Science Fiction Club, let's go on
yep.
to the next one. We've looked at the next one. Oh, that's right, because we went back to look at Opus or whatever it's called. So the next slide, please. Yeah, we've looked at that one. Let's go on to the next one. Right. So in about 1965, this little critical mass has got to the stage where they're thinking about doing something. Down in a little cafe in the Graves Tavern, the name of which are Jenny's. They go there for meals to get together. They go together, and someone, probably John Foyster, gets the idea. Let's hold a convention.
It would be
So,
Foyster.
and of course, it's Foyster. You know Foyster.
Oh,
Foyster
yeah.
is the person who has bright ideas and then tells other people to do them. But in this occasion, there were not too many bright people. There is basically Merv Binns, Lee Harding, John Foyster, and John Bangsund to run this convention. Anyhow, they put together this convention, which is held over Easter 1966. Now, there were slips put into all the books that Merv was selling at McGill's. And the reason I went to this convention was because I got this slip. And I'm just down from the country, and I think, if I go to this, I can tell my parents I don't have to come home for Easter. So it's entirely by accident that I was at the 1966 convention. I remember nothing about it, well, apart from a couple of things. But this is the only pictures I've found of the 1966 convention. So up in the top left, we've got John Bangsund again. We've got Dick Jensen. There was an auction. I bought a lot of thrilling wonders at that. We've got John Baxter. And I don't know the fellow behind. Then there's John Foyster. And then down the bottom, we've got Stephen Cook. In fact, these three guys are science fiction writers. Isn't that amazing? Science fiction writers in Australia. Stephen Cook, who committed suicide a year or so later. Win Whitford, who is actually selling to the American magazines. And the reason he's doing that is because he went to New York in about 57 and actually got to meet the editors. So he knew what was going on in America and had contacts there. Damien Broderick's joined Baxter and Harding writing science fiction, and I think he's also selling to New Worlds. And then we've got Lee Harding and Eric Harding as well. So this is the 1960 convention. At the 1960 convention, there was a panel on science fiction. And at it, in fact, I remember it as being electric, but I don't remember what actually happened. But at that, someone said, "We're having such a good time, let's continue it." And so Harding says, we'll produce a magazine. And they all look and they say, who's going to produce this magazine? And they all point at John Bangsund. So next slide, please. And they point at John Bangsund because he's the literate one amongst them. Harding knows Harding and Foyster know their science fiction, but Bangsund Bangsund doesn't know what he's getting into, quite honestly. So, and the other thing about it is that only in the couple of months before this convention, both Foyster and Bangsund got married. So it actually adds to the strain of this. But the three of them, Harding, Foyster, and Bangsund, get together, and Harding and Foyster use their fanzine production experience and their knowledge of science fiction to urge John Bangsund along. So Australian Science Fiction Review is produced. The other thing about the Australian Science Fiction Review is that John Bangsund at this stage is a traveller for castles. And so he's visiting other Australian states. And where he goes, he takes, publishers. And so wherever he goes, he takes copies of ASFR with him and he puts it in shops. And there's a little form in there that you can subscribe to ASFR. Now, in comparison to every previous Australian science fiction fanzine, this one is readable, illiterate, exciting and interesting. Trouble is, as a fannish fan, I've got no idea what it's about, but I know that it's firing people up. It's creating, and after about 3 or 4 issues, it's starting to get letters from fans and writers overseas. It takes that long simply because by the time you post one of these things, it takes a month to get anywhere outside Australia, and then it takes by email another 2 weeks to get back again. So if you're producing monthly, it takes 2 months for anything that you've produced in Australia to reach overseas and for you to get the feedback. But it starts to pick up an international reputation. It starts to attract some of the key writers, the Le Guins, the Dicks, the Aldises, the Harry Harrisons. Or at one stage, anyone who was anyone in science fiction around the world was writing letters to or contributing to ASFR, mainly because Foyster and Harding knew the science fiction and Bangsund knew how to put it together to make it interesting, attractive to people. So this little group is now building up overseas and knowledge about an interest in Australia. But more to the point, it's building up, building this little central core more. So if we go to the next picture, there is the growth of a group of fans in Australia around this little nucleus. It's like a pearl growing. So this is taken in Bangsund's backyard, probably in about 1968. So we've got Bangsund, we've got me, we've got Lee Harding, John Foyster, Tony Thomas, who comes in through the Science Fiction Club and is as literate as the Bangsunds and the Foysters and Hardings, Merv Binns and Paul Stevens from the Science Fiction Club. So this is a part of a symptom of the growing fandom in Australia. So let's go on to the next one. So there was no convention in 1960. Oh, this is the other end. So you can see the table tennis table down the bottom. This is the auction. They thought there was nothing in 1967. They thought, well, we're not good enough to hold a convention. We'll hold a conference. So it was basically a convention. The first 2 days, I think, were held in the Melbourne Science Fiction Club. You can see so they're sitting at the table tennis table, they're auctioning stuff. Dick was a very good auctioneer. And the screen, you can see the screen. You can also see the open window. When they were playing table tennis and they had the windows open, they lost a lot of balls out through the window. And you can tell it's the 68 conference by the badges they're wearing. You remember was it called The Prisoner? There was a TV series set in the Welsh village with bouncing balls, and main character was 68. So all the badges for the 68 convention were the penny farthing bicycles. So that's how I could the captions that come with these things say it was the 66 convention, but from the badges, it's obviously 68. So the first 2 days, I think, were at the Old Melbourne Science Fiction Club. And if we go to the next one, you'll see that films are an important part of what's going on. So they went to a hall somewhere. And this is, once again, this growing collection of fans. So from the left, we've got John Breeden. Behind him is Bill Wright. be hiding behind the wall is Dmitry Razovayev. I think the next person is Gerald Carr, but I'm not sure. Then we've got Merv, we've got Paul Stevens hiding behind, and then John Brosnan. Hiding behind them is Kevin Dillon, who's a leftover from the 1950s Sydney fandom. So I didn't know anything. If I'd known, of course, Kevin Dillon, we sat around chatting. If I know now what I would like to have known then, and what I would have found out from Kevin Dillon would have filled a book. I didn't know, I didn't ask him. So anyhow, in '68, we decided that we would branch out. We had more of an emphasis on movies because science fiction movies actually starting to get a bit interesting. So let's go to the next one and see what happens.
Well, before we jump through to that, how's the ASFR, the fanzine scene going? Is it just purely and simply ASFR, or has it started to spread out a little bit?
It's starting to spread out. I got the publishing bug, and so I published my first fanzine in 1960, at the end of 1967, and I published. I didn't know what else to do, so I took up publishing Etherline Mark II, and did 3 or 4 issues of that. And then that got tedious, so I did other things. There's Bernie Burnhouse and his friend did Austral Fan Tales. There's Gary Woodman, and one issue of they discovered drugs basically, which we'll come to in a minute. And there's another one. Gary Woodman did a fanzine. Paul Stevens produced a fanzine called Opus, 1 issue only. He then produced another fanzine called Little Supo Deluxe, because Supo is Opus backwards. But there wasn't much of a publishing scene. There was another fan who emerged in Sydney, Ron Clark, sometime in the early 1960s. He and some school friends produced a fanzine called Mentor. So there's Mentor coming out of Sydney, which is not really associated with anyone, but he's discovered these things. So really ASFR is it. But what John Bangsund began to discover was that he was more interested in fandom than he was in science fiction. So ASFR ran for 2 years, and then sort of, well, what happened, the second last issue, John Foyster produced, and it was the typical, razor-sharp criticism that I just didn't understand. And then Bangsund produced 1 more issue. What he then discovered was that you could write about other things. And so he just took the number and produced Skythrop. But he also discovered that you could produce all kinds of things. So, him and his typewriter and his duplicator did all kinds of strange things, which you will know about from trying to collect them all together. John just discovered that fan writing was much more interesting and much more fun than writing about science fiction, which left a hole. Can we go on? Because I need to get to this, and I know I've got slides on it. So we can go back to the slides, please, because I think I've organised this a bit to talk about I think. Here we go. So we've got this 68. This is a 68 conference. You can tell again they've got the round badges, because once again, in the record, it's down as a 69 convention. Onwards. The 69 National Convention was held in a picture theatre at Murrumbeena. And in fact, 2 or 3 conventions were held at Murrumbeena, because it was basically a picture theatre where we showed movies. We'd actually begun to discuss that we didn't have much to talk about at conventions. There's only 20 or so of us. We start saying the same thing. But if we show movies, so, 2001's now available. Silent Running's available. This new generation of science fiction is becoming available. I think it's at this convention that the first Ditmars were awarded. Various people have got ideas about where Ditmars come from. Of course, Ditmar is Dick Tenson's real name. My memory is that there was a committee meeting at which we thought, we might give awards, might be an interesting thing to do. You've got to pay for them. And Dick said, I'll pay for them. And so we call it, well, since Dick's paying for them, we won't call them Dicks. We'll call them Ditmars.
Just so people know, these are the basically the Australian Science Fiction Achievement Awards that been handed out since about this time, 1968 at the Australian National Convention.
Yeah, it would be 69.
in various fiction and fannish categories.
Yeah, yeah. So they're not called Dicks, they're called Ditmars. So science fiction in Melbourne is having these conventions. They're meeting at the Melbourne Science Fiction Club every week, and they're also starting to have parties, or go out together in various places. So Melbourne Fandom is very social. It's got a weekly meeting place so that you can go there anytime. I used to go there and meet people, Bernie, Paul Stevens, Gary Woodman, and then there was a pinball, not a pinball, a snooker parlour down at the end of the lane. So we'd go and spend Sunday, go and meet at the club, and then go and play snooker in the afternoon. Or not very good snooker players. Next, please. Right. So the person who gets the publishing bug the worst is Bruce Gillespie.
And he's
The other
still
thing
got
that
it.
happened, oh, you're not wrong there. So this is the first issue of science fiction commentary. What happened was that because Bangsund had lost the interest in producing writing about science fiction, he passed all his critical stuff off to Bruce, because Bruce had actually sent him a couple of articles that I don't think may have got published, but most of them didn't. And Bruce ended up getting them back again. Bruce wanted to publish the critical stuff. Bangsund was happy with that, meant he could go and publish the fannish stuff. So Bruce started SF Commentary in, I think, 1969. The first issue, as I recall, was printed by me and Lee Harding on the AFPA duplicator in the Melbourne Science Fiction Club. And it was, Bruce didn't know very much about cutting stencils, so it was a bit of a struggle. So that this is the continuation of that critical stream of.
Where's Bruce this morning?
I've no idea where Bruce is.
Well,
Bruce doesn't understand Zoom.
I
Bruce doesn't
can tell you
understand
that no, he doesn't do Zoom, and he has a heck of a lot of trouble with technology. So he hasn't
Wow.
come. He wouldn't have joined us.
No, he won't know anything about this. But so Bruce picks up that publishing side, the critical analysis side of science fiction, and really he becomes one of the centers of this kind of writing about science fiction, really until the academics discover science fiction as a way of making their academic careers. And then a lot of what would have appeared in ASFR or SF Commentary or similar fanzines then goes into the academic journals. But Bruce still does it. But his criticism, his reviewing isn't of the same intellectual standards used to be, simply because if you can make a reputation, publish academic papers, that's what you do. But this is the beginning of more publishing in Australia. Can we go to the next one? I think the next one continues this. I had forgotten about science fiction writing in Australia. A fellow we'll come across, Ron Graham. In fact, Ron Graham is probably one of the few fans in Australia who was in first fandom. He discovered science fiction back when he was very young, but he was an engineer who got a patent in something, and he became very wealthy. He had the biggest science fiction collection in Australia, but he also was a fan of John Russell Fearn. And there was a guy in England whose name I now forget, that attracted Ron Graham's attention. And they got up the idea of producing a professional science fiction magazine. But because they liked John Russell Fearn, and also because the new wave was coming, and so there's New Worlds has got a new wave in Britain, they're going to produce ye old style science fiction magazine. At the same time, because Ron Graham is an Australian, because he's been involved, he actually paid for John Bangsund's first duplicator. I think he might have supported Bruce in some way as well. So he decided that he was going to make this also an Australian science fiction magazine. So he got John Bangsund as the editor in Australia to select Australian stories. A certain percentage of stories in every issue was going to be Australian. John Bangsund was going to be the editor, and away we went. Trouble was, Phil Harbottle knew almost nothing about whatever he needed to know. He and John Bangsund fell out, so John had resigned from it before the first issue had been published. So I think there was about a dozen issues before basically distribution. Then probably Phil Harbottle's ability not to select good stories killed it. but it was the first attempt to publish science fiction in Australia.
Was
Actually
this was
published.
this was this being based with its sort of head office, for want of a better term, in Sydney or in Melbourne?
No, it was based in Brisbane, in England.
In England.
We-
Oh, okay.
all that happened was some of the fiction was going to be written by Australians. So Harding, maybe Broderick, what have we got down there? Jack Wadhams, yes,
Jack
Jack
Wadhams
Wadhams.
as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a little generation. There's another fella whose name I forget who started selling to them.
David Rome.
David Rome, yeah. Start selling to Vision of Australia, but only last year. And then there's no sign. Well, we could write a book about what, in fact, I'm sure someone has. Let's go on. We're talking about fandom. But Vision, so fan publishing in Australia sometime about the middle of 1960. What year that, 68?
68,
Yeah,
October 68.
yeah, sometime around the middle of 1968, Ron Clark said, we've got to find a way of encouraging publishing in Australia and fanzine publishing in Australia, or doing something about it. And I heard about these things called APPAs. And I said, you wouldn't mind being in those. So I got on the waiting list of SAPS, FAPA and APPA 45. But they were waiting lists. So I thought, oh, bugger that, I'll do something about it. So I sent out a little sheet to everyone saying, I'm starting an APPA in Australia. Do you want to join? And so that's the first issue of ANZAPPA. So first mailing of ANZAPPA. It was called APPA in the beginning, until we decided that ANZAPPA was a much better title than APPA. And so
It's actually interesting to have a look at that first list of members there. And if you run down through the list, and both Leigh and I are members of ANZAPPA at the moment. So Leigh is still a member. Well, he's been in and out, but he's back in as a member. Gary Mason is still a member, and with that's Bruce Gillespie. So three of the original members in October 1968 are currently members of ANZAPPA, the successor to this. Well, it's the same. It's actually the same APPA, but it's just changed its name. Should say.
The other thing about this is that it reminds me, if you go down the list, you'll see two names there, John Ryan and Gary Mason, who aren't science fiction fans. What they are is comic fans. For some reason, we discovered science fiction fans or comic fans discovered each other. So there's an alliance in Australia to build up this critical mass more. There's an alliance between comic fans and science fiction fans, so that as well as Baxter, who's really gaffiated to become a science fiction writer, as well as that, the fans we're starting to know in Sydney are the comics fans, in particular Gary Mason and John Ryan, John Brosnan, who actually began as a science fiction fan, Peter Darling. There's a group of people who get to know each other in Sydney. Now, they come to know each other because in 1968, I think it's 1967, 68, can't remember, Paul Stevens and I were sharing a house in St Kilda, in South Melbourne. And one Friday evening, a car pulls up and John Bangsund gets out and says, Jack Williamson and Lee Brackett are going to be in Sydney over the weekend. Where are you going to go and see them? Do you want to come? So Paul and I pile into the back of this car and we drive overnight to Sydney. When we get to Sydney, we find out we can't see Williamson and Lee Brackett. But what John did was he pulled out his mailing list of all the subscribers to ASFR and he rang them up. And so I've met strange people like John Danzer and Pat Terry that weekend. And out of that grew a new fan group in Sydney called the Sydney Science Fiction Foundation. So they, strangely, it's in the air in Sydney, don't know what's going on. They had to have a constitution. They had to have formal meetings. Melbourne fans weren't doing any of this. Well, actually, as a sidebar, for some reason, Melbourne fans decided to get organised, and the club had a constitution for about 3 weeks. So they formed the Sydney Science Fiction Foundation. They have a fanzine called The New Forerunner. Relates back to the 1950s, and Doug Nicholson's the forerunner. And so Sydney fans are starting to get together as well. So there's now a fan group forming in Sydney, about 68, 69. And so some of them...
Sorry, can I interrupt again?
Yeah,
Other
yeah.
people, if you're looking at this particular screen, if you have a look down through, there's only 11 members of the APA here, but they're all either in Victoria or in New South Wales.
Exactly.
We don't have anybody here from either Queensland, South Australia, or West Australia.
No, and in fact, if you look, let's go to New South Wales. Ron Clark is a science fiction fan. Peter Darling's a science fiction fan.
Who ended up in Victoria. Yep.
Yeah. So if we didn't have comic fans, there would only be Peter Darling and Ron Clark. And Peter Darling we wouldn't have known about. So there would have only been Ron Clark. So this alliance with comics fans gave us a lot of strength and a lot of energy. Gary Mason in particular. Is still anyhow. Gary Mason is a lovely fella if you don't get him too excited about things. Onwards. So let's go to the next one.
He's the official editor.
He's David. The other thing that's happening in this because the Science Fiction Club, the Melbourne Science Fiction Club, really doesn't talk critically about science fiction. Foyster, once again, John Foyster, with some friends, decides to form a science fiction discussion group. So I went to the first meeting and I was bored witless because I actually talked about science fiction. So this is the second meeting. Actually, I would have gone to that too, which ended up being called the Nova Mob, which was a monthly get together to talk about science fiction. And it's still running
and it is still running on a monthly basis, first Wednesday of every month.
Yep. Are they still Zooming it? Can you still
they are.
Right.
Yep, they are.
And I'm invited to go, but she's talking about science fiction. Anyhow, so there are other things starting to happen in Melbourne because there's a critical mass. Because some people think that we're not talking about science fiction, let's form a science fiction discussing group. Because there's not enough publishing going on, let's form an APA to encourage all these things to go on. So this group is building momentum and inertia. It now has a sub-branch in Sydney.
Were they building a momentum towards something? Was there a feeling that they were going somewhere, or was it just that they wanted to get more involved in more fannish activity happening?
As Lee Harding once said, it's basically, I've got more people to talk to.
Okay. So it's more social and more than anything else. And
yes, the social group. Once again, it's like going to Melbourne Science Fiction Club, except you now go to the Nova Mob or you go to someone's place and hold a collating party. You're all science fiction fans together because if you end up talking about science fiction, people won't think you're strange, as they do in the mundane world. So let's go on to the next one. Yes, Bundle on Court. This became the centre of what you would call fannish fandom in Australia. After John and Diane separated, John moved into Bundle on Court. And you could go there almost any time. It wasn't quite a revolving party because John had to go to work occasionally. But you'd go there, there'd be collating parties, there'd be sitting around listening to music, there'd be talking about things, planning things. There's another organisation that John and Bill Wright tried to set up. They had this idea. Well, actually, the two ideas come together. They thought that if we had a national convention, a national organisation, it could do things like run conventions and have a newsletter. And they set up this thing called the Communications Organisation, which met in Bundle on Court. Comorg it was called. And I thought it was a crazy idea, so I set up another counter-organisation. So there's a little sort of fannish banter going on in Australia, but for a period of about 3 or 4 years, Bundle on Court was where the action was. The person sitting next to John Bangsund is the one on the left. The one on the right is Velma's mother. Don't know why she's in the picture, but there she is. Maybe it was a picture. Anyhow, onwards. So, and this, I put this one in particularly because this is a reference back to Melbourne fandom in the 1950s. What John is holding is a copy of Lee Harding's first fanzine and the first attempt in Australia to produce a fannish genzine. You'll read about it in some detail in the history of the first part of Fandom. In fact, apart from the fact that when Leigh and Dick did this, they had no idea how to produce a fanzine. This was the first fanzine produced in Melbourne after Warren Hockley stopped publishing in 1941. So these guys taught themselves by looking at the fanzines they got from overseas. So the reason John's holding it like that is because in comparison to the standards of ASFR and Skyscrop, it's not very good. Onwards. That's my indulgence. The other thing that happens was Star Trek happens. And so girls start turning up at conventions, which of course was of great interest to male fans. So we've got Donna Roonick, who's I went out with a few times. I've forgotten the name of the next woman along, and then there's Sabina Heggie and Shane McCormick. Of them, Shane actually became quite involved in the fannish side of science fiction fandom, but Star Trek in particular brought in a whole wave of females, but it also brought in Star Trek fandom, and they start having their own organizations, their own groups. And so science fiction fandom starts mingling not only with comic fans, but also with Star Trek fans who just happen to be female, which is very nice. And that's taken at Murrumbeena, I think, probably in 1969 and 1970. And this is the first time we've seen women at conventions. Next, well, mostly. Next, please. This Sydney group is starting to get together, get organised, and they decide they're going to hold a convention. So we've got in this picture, we've got from the left, across the bottom, we've got John Ryan, Robin Johnson, Peter Darling, and I think the other one's Ron Clark. Across the top, we've got Gary Mason and I don't know who.
John Brosnan.
Is it John Brosnan, the one at the top? You sure? He's taller than I remember him. No, Gary's short, isn't he? So this is a group that got to get together in Sydney. They decide they're going to hold a convention. And for us people in Melbourne, this was wonderful because we didn't have to do anything. We just had to get to Sydney. Next slide, please, Maestro.
So this is the 1970 SynCon.
Yeah, at New Year's, it was held in the Scout Hall. The thing that brought this convention alive was that John Ryan was in contact with all the comics artists in Australia. And so they turned up one day and John ran a fascinating, because these comic artists are also doing science fiction comic art. And so it was the most lively thing that had happened at a convention in Australia for, well, 4 or 5 years, running this session of comic artists talking about drawing comics, selling comics, and the science fiction content of science fiction. There was another key thing that happened at this convention. If we go to the next picture, the next picture is just some more funny faces. So it's in the Scout Hall. So you're either at the convention or you're out in the park. It's one of the problems with holding conventions in halls. So that's Paul Stevens, Bob Smith, and Lee Harding trying to get away from a part of the convention sitting outside. Next one, we might get onto the point. So around, I reckon about the end of 1967, but definitely in 1968, this group was starting to think that maybe they would do something. And so John Bangsund sent this letter to Andy Porter, and it says Melbourne in SF. The reason 75 is because it's science fiction. That's why we chose 75. Melbourne is, and so Andy replied with an ad in, I think, a Nikon 3 program book, which I couldn't find to put here, which just said Australia in 75. And we looked, I remember actually, at this stage, Paul Stevens and I were sharing a house with John and Diane Bangsund, and this is when you got mail on Saturdays. We'd gone down to the laundromat and we'd done our washing, and we came back and there was mail. We opened it up, and the sun's coming in through. It's almost like angels did there with trumpets. You open it up and it says Australia at 75, and you think, gee, we could do that. But it was just an idea until.
So this was just an idea, bit of a joke on Bangsund's behalf.
A bit of a joke. Yep.
Yeah, so many conventions and world cons have started like a bit of a joke. Anyway, so it's good to know that this one, the very first one in Australia, started exactly the same way.
Yep. So if we go on to the next one, we go back to SynCon 70. And at SynCon 70, they actually had a session at the convention. Do we think we can do this? Do we want to do this? And out of this came, point at Muggins me, let's discuss it. Let's talk about it before we actually decide. So I get the job of every 2 weeks producing this thing called Australia in 75. You wrote me letters or you sent in stencils. I ran them off every 2 weeks. I circularized to anyone who was interested these things.
Can I ask the question here? At this time, we're here in January 1970.
Yeah.
5.5 years before Aussicon is going to be held in Melbourne.
Yeah.
Had anybody in Australia been actually to a Worldcon at that point?
Yeah. Robin Johnson.
Robin Johnson.
Yeah, Robin's the only person who knows anything about any of this. Robin's the only one who's actually met any fans overseas. We just know there's fandom overseas because we get fanzines and letters. That's all we know.
Ron Smith.
Yeah, Ron Smith disappeared off into publishing. You're right, Ron, but Ron had sort of gaffeated to a large extent.
So he's the fan that migrated from the US over to Australia after the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he would have been going to conventions in the US.
Yeah,
in the period of time that he was there.
But he'd cut off contact in 62. The other person is Robin, who is born in Australia, brought up in England, but moved back to Australia in 69 for reasons I'll find out about later. 69, 68? 69.
I think we do need to do a session with Robin.
Well,
regarding his whole fannish history. There's enough there to be going on with.
But Robin has bumped into the Sydney Science Fiction Foundation. So Robin is involved in organising SynCon 70. So, but apart from that, and in fact, Robin, because we discussed this problem about running a Worldcon in Australia, and at this stage, one of the important problems is the organisation of the World Science Fiction Society and how its rotation system is. So the first job we've got is actually to get the constitution of the World Science Fiction changed so that we can actually run a World Science Fiction convention in Australia when we want it. So Robin is sent to HiCon, along with Bruce Pells, I think.
This is the HiCon in Heidelberg in Germany.
Yeah, to make sure.
1972? 1970. All right.
Yeah. So that Robin actually produced a flyer that went on an aircraft that was flying American fans to Heidelberg called, it was Hijack, which is of course not a terribly thing to hand out on an aeroplane.
You wouldn't do that now, not at a blue fit.
but it's about convincing. When we discuss this business of do we want to have a world convention, there's a number of things you need to talk about. The first is, how do we actually convince Americans they want to come to Australia? So it's going to be a publicity campaign. Can we afford to run a world convention? Is there the infrastructure in Australia to run a convention? So all these things are debated. I don't think there was ever any doubt that we were going to decide to run one, but we had to figure out whether in fact it was feasible for us small group of fans on the other side of the world to actually want to ask fans from around the rest of the world to come. Go on to the next one, which I think is, I've put there basically for my amusement.
Part of the thing, just if I could interlude here, part of the reason why you were able to carry on and do this is you didn't know how hard it was actually going to be when you first started it off.
Robin, apparently at the end of Aussicon, was found wandering up, it was at Burke Street in the tram tracks.
Yeah.
So we exchanged all these correspondence, we talked it all through, and then at the Easter Convention, which was a national convention in 1970, we had a meeting. Had a panel session about it where the topic was debated. And John Foyster brought up the motion that you read there, where is it? That this convention resolves not to bid for an Australian Worldcon under any circumstances. It's actually a very clever motion, which shows you how clever John Foyster was. He moved that motion. Then they debated for another 20 minutes about whether you could actually have a negative motion. But in the end, it was put to the vote, and it was decided that Australia would not hold a World Science Fiction Convention. And then Bangsund says, right, well, that's got that out of the way. What then happened was that a committee was put together to bid for a World Science Fiction Convention. And it was supposedly a committee of Melbourne and Sydney fans. But to a large extent, it was Melbourne because we got together. Now, if we go on to the next slide, this tells another part of the story. Oh, actually, this is Robin again. But the other person, and I'll put this in, is because Robin ended up being the chair of the Worldcon bid and Christine ended up being the treasurer. And it's the only chance I've got to put a picture of Christine.
This is the late Christine Ashby.
Yeah, this would have been taken.
Christine McGowan, as she was then.
Yeah, Christine McGowan, as she was then. I think that's once again my indulgence. Onwards with the history. We're still, one of the things we've got to do is we've got to change the infrastructure of fandom in Australia. The 1971 National Convention was held in an old tin hall at Melbourne University. There was one particular session that was amazingly tedious. And halfway through this session, Lee Harding sticks his head in and says, there's the gelati van outside. And almost the entire convention disappears out of the session and stands in a queue. So it's called Gelaticon in fannish memory. Look, there are a number of well-known fans there, but there are too many to go on with. So one of the things we've got to do is we've got to learn how to hold proper conventions rather than what we've been doing. The reason we're at that convention is because Dick was by this stage on the academic side of Melbourne University. So it's in Melbourne University because Dick got the hall. Onwards. Other groups are getting together. Now, an Adelaide group formed around this time, actually based around Adelaide University. Starts off as a sort of a science club and then evolves into a science fiction club. So they held their first convention, Advention 1, around this time. And a lot of I don't think I went. A lot of Melbourne's turn up. There's lots of pictures of Melbourne fans having a roaring good time. This is there because it's a colour picture. So we've got Bill Wright and John Bangsund at Advention 1, held at a sort of little country retreat owned by Adelaide University. And next one. The other thing that happened was because the Fantasy Film Group was the mob that bought in, was the way in which the club brought in money. Merv and Paul Stevens and a couple of other friends thought very big about improving the Fantasy Film Group. So they started installing projectors in the place. The trouble was they were showing nitrate film. And so someone thought that nitrate film in a place where you could only escape through a thin stairway which had built by then, or a hydraulic lift, was going to be a fire trap. So they reported the Melbourne Science Fiction Club to the fire authorities. The club was closed. Simple as that. What this did do was it freed Mervyn Binns to leave McGill's. Mervyn all wanted to run his own shop. So he got a loan of $7,000 from Ron Graham and decided to open his own bookshop called Space Age Books to begin with. I got Lee Harding involved to help him with it. Lee was a struggling writer. Lee needed a job. So Lee came in as Merv's assistant. They worked out of an office originally, and then they found this shop in Swanson Street opposite the library. The advantage of this shop was that it was on the path from the railway station that students went past, up to Melbourne Uni and the RMIT, Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology then, so that a lot of people walked past his shop twice a day. So it's old science fiction. Lee Harding went out and he found out what the kids were looking at, which is a lot of counterculture, a lot of all kinds of interesting stuff. And so as well as the science fiction and the movies that that Merv's interested in. Leigh's getting in the counterculture stuff. So Space Age does very well. What also comes out of this is that Leigh is at the shop on Wednesdays, and he apparently says to me, I don't remember this, he says to Leigh, it says to me, I'm going to be in town on Wednesday evening. I'm going to be down at De Grave's Tavern. Do you want to come? And so apparently we started meeting that other people started coming. And so as well, with the Melbourne Science Fiction Club closed, there was nowhere to meet. But at the same time, we start meeting weekly down at De Grave's Tavern. The food's awful, the wine's awful, but it's open. And so people start congregating there. And so, in fact, as the Australia 75 bit evolves, poor old Robin here is the chairman by this stage, we'd all be sitting down there, and then Robin would come in with his suit, with his briefcase, and he'd open it up, and then we'd say, what's going on with the bid, Robin? Or what's going on with the convention? But it became, De Grave's Tavern became the social hub of fandom in Melbourne, as well as upstairs at the Space Age books. So there was a room up there, so you could also go there. That was also the club. So things came together nicely with Space Age and De Grave's Tavern. And then we started getting people coming into Space Age who would then get attracted into fandom or the project of running a Worldcon. Yes.
So which you're here in the early
We're talking
1970s.
71. Talking
71.
1970.
71.
So we're bidding
Okay.
for a Worldcon. We'll find out what the next slide reminds me of.
So just to remind people at this stage,
The other
bidding
thing,
was 2 years ahead. So they were going to be bidding in 1973.
yeah,